And there wasn't one of us in our battalion that ever got to the German lines. You couldn't. It was absolutely impossible.
The Battle of the Somme is one of the most famous military events in British history, synonymous with huge loss of life and costly failure. After months of deadlock on the Western Front, a joint British and French offensive was planned to break through the German lines north of the River Somme in mid-1916. Donald Murray became aware of increasing preparations during the summer.
We didn't realise then what was in the offing, but we soon learned because we started making preparations, preparing for a really big affair. And in May, they took us from the line back about 10 kilometres, right away from the fighting. And there they'd got the whole country flagged out, exact replica of the German lines with little flags. And we started practicing the attack, ready for the big attack, this big attack that was to come. In the meantime, there was a constant procession of guns going up. Instead of the big guns that used to lie right back, miles back, they were bringing them right up into the front.
Charles Quinnell of the Royal Fusiliers also noted the signs of an impending offensive.
By this time, we realised that something big was being prepared, because we could see the number of guns, new guns that were arriving on the front, the amount of shells that were coming. There'd been a great shortage before, but now you could see in the railways were loaded up with guns, ammunition, wagons and so forth and so on. And we knew something big was coming off.
British NCO A. Wood found out why such a large volume of guns and ammunition was being moved to the front.
We were taken out of the front line and were taken to an obscure place. I couldn't tell you what it was, 60 years ago. And we were told by the generals of the battle that was going to be on the 1st of July. And we were also told that there wouldn't be a German within miles, because the front line had been flattened by the artillery which had been bombarding it.
The British Commander-in-Chief, General Sir Douglas Haig, planned an intensive week-long bombardment of the German lines. He hoped that this would enable the infantry to break through and be followed up by a strong cavalry advance. Royal Garrison Artillery Officer Maurice Laws described his role in the bombardment.
Well, I was an observation officer for the battery in a forward OP, and I had a couple of signallers with me and a telephone communication with the battery. And my job was to observe the fire of the battery on our various targets all day, which started dawn and went on till dusk. And every evening a fatigue party arrived with water and food, mails, and went away again. And we lived there like that. And I stayed there until certainly the evening of the 1st of July. I went back to the battery. I could hardly read anything because my eyes were so strained from looking through prismatic glasses all that time. And you see, shooting at a trench, you've got to be exact, you've got to be very careful. And it went on day after day, hours and hours. There was so much daylight, I wish to God it was midnight. I mean, it really was very trying.
During the opening bombardment, the Royal Artillery fired over 1.6 million shells. The intensity of the attack was unprecedented. It left a vivid impression on all those who witnessed it. British signaller Harry Wheeler recalled the deafening noise the artillery made.
Firing was going on for weeks beforehand, on and off, getting heavier. But the bombardment, when that started, It was what I always called the dance of hell. Yeah, when it happened, it was bump, 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 shells bursting all the time over, the guns firing rather, all the time. It was a dance of hell right enough for those poor boys who had to go through it. By God, I could never get it out of my memory. Yes, the dance of hell.
And for Royal Flying Corps pilot Cecil Lewis, the sight of so many guns in action remained clear in his mind long afterwards.
When you had to go right over the lines, you see, you were midway between our guns firing and where the shells were falling. And during that period, the intensity of the bombardment was such that it was really like a sort of great broad swathe of dirty-looking cotton wool, laid over the ground, that's so close with the shell bursts and so continuous that it wasn't just a puff here and a puff there, it was a continuous band, The whole of the ground beneath the darkening evening was just like a veil of sequins which were flashing and flashing and flashing, and each one was a gun,
Stephen Westmann was a German army officer who lived through the barrage.
We were under incessant bombardment. Day and night the shells, heavy and light ones, came upon us. Our dugouts crumbled. They fell upon us, and we had to dig ourselves and our comrades out. Sometimes we found them suffocated, sometimes smashed to pulp. Soldiers in the bunkers became hysterical. They wanted to run out, and fights developed to keep them in the comparative safety of our deep bunkers. Even the rats became hysterical. They came into our flimsy shelters to seek refuge from this terrific artillery fire. We had nothing to eat, nothing to drink, but constantly shell after shell burst upon us.
On the eve of the battle, the attacking infantry troops were moved up to the front line. British Private Reginald Glenn recalled the feeling as they went forward.
Well, we didn't know until the actual day that we were going in. And we went in at night, and we got so far in, and then it was told no smoking. Everybody had got their big overcoats and haversack with rations in, and everybody was hoping to carry something as well. And we just went in and relieved the regiments that were in. They came out of one set of trenches, we went down the others, because with having all your accoutrements, there wasn't room to pass one another. And I suppose we were a bit worried about what was going to happen, because the night before they'd been writing letters home.
Many of the men had a heartening tot of rum as they waited for 0 hour. Some had several. But Donald Murray decided it was best to abstain.
The previous night at about 12 p.m, each dugout had a stone bottle of rum put into the dugout, a gallon bottle, and nearly every man was drunk, blind drunk. And I thought to myself, this looks to me like a sacrifice. And I never touched any. I didn't have a single drink. I determined to keep my head. And it's just as well I did.
In the lead up to the infantry assault, a final heavy bombardment was made on the German lines. Royal Garrison Artillery Officer W. Walter Symonds described it.
At 5:30, the barrage came down. It consisted of light artillery on the front line, coupled with light howitzers. 300 yards beyond that came down the heavier natures, the 6-inch, the 60-pounder, the 8-inch, the 9.2s, and the 12-inch and 15-inch howitzers were allotted special targets and strong points, such as fortified villages. Within a few moments, the air vibrated with concussion.
0 hour was set for 7:30 a.m. on the 1st of July. As it approached, the men prepared for battle in crowded front-line trenches. Private R. Mason was among them.
We'd reached our attacking positions overnight and were all ready for the assault an hour before we had to go. And we sat down crouching in the shallow, narrow trench, almost shoulder to shoulder. I was next to the officer and got him something out of his own haversack because he could not turn round to the back. And he said very shortly, "Only 5 minutes to go."
Finally, the barrage lifted, and the moment came for men like Private Arthur Pearson to go over the top.
Well, we were anxious to be over the top, and at 0 hour, at 7:30, everybody, we climbed out of the trenches. 2 platoons in advance had been laid on a white tape, and they formed the first wave. And every man climbed out of the trenches at the whistle of the officers, and not a man hesitated. But I was lucky. I was in a part of the trench where the parados had been battered down as Jerry sought for a trench mortar. When I ran up the rise out of the trench, I was under the hail of bullets which were whizzing over my head. But most of our fellows were killed kneeling on the fire step on the parados.
Once out of the relative safety of their trenches, the attacking troops had been ordered to advance slowly towards the Germans in long lines. Maurice Symes, like many others, didn't think much of this order.
It was just as if we were in, that almost was like a training exercise, which was really, I suppose, absolutely mad when you come to think of it. We were just in extended order with everything on your back, your rifle bedded and trenching tool and everything else, just in walking straight towards the German lines in extended order. Well, they were sitting ducks all the way, you see. Our early training, see, for warfare, run so far and lie down, and then run a bit further. But this was all just walking straight into the death trap, hundreds of us. It was hopeless.
Officer Alfred Irwin approved an unusual initiative by one of his officers to motivate the troops under his command.
Well, Captain Neville was commanding B Company, one of our 2 assaulting companies. And a few days before the Battle of the Somme, he came to me with a suggestion that as he and his men were all equally ignorant of what their conduct would be when they got into action, he thought it might be helpful, as he had 400 yards to go and knew that it would be covered by machine gun fire. It would be helpful if he could furnish each platoon with a football and allow them to kick it forward and follow it. And that was the beginning of the idea. And I sanctioned that on condition that he and his officers really kept command of the units and didn't allow it to develop into a rush after the ball. If a man came across the football, he could kick it forward, but he mustn't chase after it. And I think myself that it did help them enormously. It took their minds off it. But they suffered terribly. Neville and his second captain were both killed.
As the men crossed no man's land, many, including Private Mason, became separated from their comrades.
My officer called across to me and said, "You stick to me and I'll stick to you." I said, "Right," but immediately lost sight of him. I didn't know what happened to him, but he was wounded. And very soon I found I was going forward, and not many were around me. At this time a hare ran along in front, to my great surprise, with its eyes bulging, or apparently bulging in fear, but I didn't think it was half as frightened as I was.
When those who had survived the crossing of no man's land neared the German front lines, it became clear why there were so few in number. The defences were still intact. Arnold Dale of the York and Lancaster Regiment couldn't believe that the deadly barbed wire was untouched.
As we moved forward, having got through our own wire quite easily, and approached the position we were to take up prior to the our own bombardment lifting so that we could move forward into the German trenches, we saw what a terrible job it was, or would be, to get through the German wire. It was so thick. It looked solid black. Can't really say that I could pick out any single strand. It was so solid that, in my opinion, a rabbit couldn't have got through it.
The men had been told that the initial bombardment would eliminate the German positions, but it had failed to do so. Walter Cook of the Royal Army Medical Corps explained why.
The Germans were down in 30-foot dugouts whilst the bombardment was on. I have personally been in one, and they were so constructed that any bomb thrown down, if there was Germans in there, would only go down so far because it would then go off at a traverse down to the 30 feet. They had selected machine gun posts, and they just mowed down the infantry, and we had a big job on.
Frank Rain of the Durham Light Infantry remembered how this affected the attack in his sector.
We were told that there was going to be this bombardment that would knock hell out of the Germans, and all we had to do was get up and walk across, and we only had to walk. On no account had we to stop for anything, and it just walked straight through to Berlin. And there wasn't one of us in our battalion that ever got to the German lines. You couldn't. It was absolutely impossible. You see what happened to the jokers, they never learned. The Germans had these deep dugouts, they were as safe as the bank. They were 30 feet down.
The Germans opened up terrific and accurate fire on the advancing British infantry, as Stephen Westmann remembered.
And then the British Army went over the top. The very moment we felt that the British artillery fire was directed against the reserve positions, machine gunners, German machine gunners, crawled out of the bunkers, reddened eyes, sunken eyes, dirty, full of blood from the blood of their fallen comrades, and opened up terrific fire. The British Army had horrible losses.
Ernest Bryan commanded a Lewis gun team during the attack. He and his men made it through no man's land, but were met by strong German fire.
The majority of their wire wasn't cut at all, not by our artillery at all, not even by our trench mortars. So, what happened? All those in there was no riflemen, but there was machine gunners. And when I talk machine gunners, I don't mean Lewis gunners. Machine gunners, who had static machine guns. You could fire 250 rounds in one belt. First thing I did, put my gun under my shoulder, and I sprayed the top. The German gunner went down whether he was hit or not, I didn't know, and I didn't care. He was down. They were all down.
Nearly 40,000 British soldiers were wounded on the 1st of July. Maurice Symes, a private in the Somerset Light Infantry, was one of them.
Well, we just scrambled out of the trench and walked forward, and you could see people going down all the way around, getting shot. It was a very pleasant feeling, and then I got hit myself, and I knocked me out. That's it. I was more surprised than anything else, really. Wonder what the devil happened. It's just like somebody kicked you in the stomach. It's a funny sort of a feeling, but I knew I couldn't go any further. I just dumped everything except my raw water bottle, crawled into a shell hole and stayed there for a bit. I had a bullet straight through. Then I got into a shell hole for a bit of shelter, and I got another sharp wound there.
With dead and wounded all around, and the attack faltering, it was no wonder that many, including NCO Frederick Higgins, felt overwhelmed by the situation.
I think I got that nasty stomach feeling that I can't describe, but it's abject fear. You're not paralysed actually, but it takes all the stuffing out of you. You just don't know what to do for the best, whether to get up and go or stop where you are or what to do. And just everybody in the same boat. I mean, big men and little men, they all suffered the same. It was terrific, terrible feeling, really.
Officer casualties were high. This led to further confusion for the attacking troops, such as Private Glenn.
We were getting just the same machine gun fire, and we were really not knowing. We weren't getting any orders at all because the officers were shot down, and we were getting this machine gun fire. It was just simply mowing them down, and I lay down, and there was nobody to give any orders.
The British attack failed in many places along the Somme battlefront. Even if men reached the German lines, They were unable to consolidate their position and were soon forced to return to their own trenches. Donald Murray gave a vivid account of the chaos of the fighting.
It seemed to me eventually I was just one man left. I couldn't see anybody at all. All I could see was men lying dead, men screaming, men on the barbed wire with the bowels hanging down, shrieking. And I thought, what can I do? I was just alone in a hell of fire and smoke and stink. And so I began to creep back towards the line, through shallows, through the mud, and down into the trench. And still there was nobody there. Gradually we congregated for ones and twos.
Although the Germans withstood the majority of the British attacks, in some places the German trenches were reached and objectives captured. But such gains were only achieved with heavy casualties. NCO D. Cattle remembered the impact this had on his regiment.
Well, I crept back on my belly into the trenches about 9 o'clock when it was getting dusk. And that was that. I went to a dugout in a trench a lot further back. There were some officers there. They were surprised to see me. They didn't think there was anybody left. And I went down into a bunk and I think I slept for 18 hours. And the Germans could have walked through if they'd wanted. There's nobody there.
In addition to the nearly 40,000 who were wounded on the 1st of July, around 20,000 men were killed. By nightfall, the devastating losses were clearly felt by Alfred Irwin.
Well, we were so lamentably few that there was very little you could do that night. But I posted the men as well as I could, and we were not attacked. We were heavily shelled that night, but we were not attacked. And so we got away with it. And the next day we were relieved. We'd come down from something like 800 to something under 200 in that attack. And it seemed to me a dreadful waste of life.
During the night, Arthur Pearson went out to retrieve casualties from no man's land.
The 10% who'd been left were called into the line as stretcher bearers, and we were carrying out our wounded all night until it was dawn. And even then we carried on. There was evidently some sort of truce in the dawn because the Germans were carrying out their casualties.
Stanley Parker Bird helped the wounded that night as a member of the Royal Army Medical Corps.
Some had already been brought in, but the no man's land was littered with casualties. They weren't as thick as peas, I couldn't use an expression like that, but some had themselves been able to crawl back to our trenches. Of course, trying to keep cheerful. Some of them would say, "Oh, shall I get to Blighty?" You had to encourage them to think they would.
The Battle of the Somme raged until mid-November 1916, but the tragic events of its first day became notorious. The casualties were the heaviest ever suffered by the British Army in any 24-hour period, and news of the losses had a huge impact upon those back home in Britain. Marjorie Llewellyn was a schoolchild in Sheffield.
Shortly after the 1st of July, the newspaper boys in the streets were shouting the news of the wounded, the killed, the battle on the Somme, and everybody rushed to buy the papers and were horrified to find that so many of our city battalion were involved in this offensive. The news came through very slowly, but there were sheets and sheets in the paper of dead and wounded, photographs where they could get them of the men, and I personally was brought out of class to be told that my cousin had been killed.
Although Royal Engineer Thomas Dewing was in the Somme area on the 1st of July 1916, he didn't take part in the attack, but he realised soon afterwards just how devastating it had been.
and it was